What if the longest tenured Maple Leaf, the alternate captain who's been through every heartbreak since 2012, is suddenly on the trading block, and the return package is somehow even more controversial than the idea of trading him in the first place? Let me paint you a picture that's equal parts fascinating and terrifying for Leafs Nation. It's December 5th, 2025, and the Toronto Maple Leafs are stuck in that familiar purgatory of being good enough to make the playoffs, but not good enough to scare anyone once they get there. The defense has been inconsistent. The goaltending is a revolving door of injuries, and the identity that Craig Berube was supposed to bring still feels more like a concept than a reality. Into this chaos steps former NHL general manager Doug MacLean with a trade proposal so bold, so controversial, so utterly insane that it's been labeled questionable by the hockey writers. And that might be the kindest description anyone could give it. The proposal? Trade Morgan Rielly, the heart and soul of the Maple Leafs defense for over a decade, straight up to the Edmonton Oilers for Darnell Nurse, the physically imposing but financially crippling defenseman who's become as much a lightning rod for criticism in Alberta as really has become in Ontario. This isn't a minor roster tweak or a depth move. This is organizational surgery without anesthesia, and the recovery period could either save the patient or kill entirely. Before we dive into why this trade makes your brain hurt in 17 different ways, we need to understand the context that's driving this conversation. Both Toronto and Edmonton entered the 2025-26 season with Stanley Cup aspirations. Both teams have generational offensive talent in Auston Matthews and Connor McDavid respectively. Both teams have spent years trying to build championship-caliber defenses around those superstars. And both teams have failed spectacularly at that task, leaving them stuck in the middle of their respective conferences, watching their championship windows slowly close while they figure out what went wrong. Morgan really has been a Maple Leaf since 2012, which in Toronto terms makes him practically a fossil. He's been the number one defenseman through multiple coaching changes, multiple roster overhauls, and multiple playoff disappointments. He's been the steady hand, the reliable presence, the guy who logs 23 minutes a night and never complains about the burden. But here's the uncomfortable truth that's driving this trade speculation. Morgan really isn't a number one defenseman on a championship team anymore, and he might not even be a top four defenseman depending on who you ask. Doug MacLean didn't mince words in his analysis, and his bluntness is what's got everyone talking. I don't know if he's a top four defenseman at this point, MacLean said, and that statement landed like a bomb in Toronto. This isn't some random Twitter troll or a frustrated fan calling into sports radio at 2 in the morning. This is a former NHL general manager with decades of experience saying out loud what a lot of people have been thinking quietly. Rielly's defensive game has regressed, his decision-making has become questionable, and his $7.5 million cap hit is starting to look less like a bargain and more like an anchor. The departure of T.J. Brodie, Rielly's longtime defensive partner, exposed just how much Rielly relied on having someone to cover for his mistakes. The arrival of Chris Tanev was supposed to provide that same stability, but Tanev is 35 years old and can't skate like he used to. The result has been a Morgan Rielly who looks lost at times, out of position more often than not, and unable to provide the offensive spark that used to justify his defensive lapses. Through the first quarter of the season, Rielly has been a liability more often than an asset, and that's simply not acceptable for a player making that kind of money. Now let's talk about Darnell Nurse, because if Morgan Rielly's contract is problematic, Nurse's contract is a full-blown catastrophe. $9.25 million per year through 2030. Let me repeat that so it sinks in. $9.25 million per year for a defenseman who's been benched multiple times this season, who makes baffling decisions with the puck, and who's become the scapegoat for every Oilers defensive breakdown. Ken Holland gave Nurse that contract in 2021, and it's been an albatross around Edmonton's neck ever since. But here's where the proposal gets interesting, and here's where Doug MacLean's logic starts to make a twisted kind of sense. Despite all of Nurse's flaws, despite the horrific contract, despite the criticism, MacLean said he would make this trade in a heartbeat. Why? Because Darnell Nurse brings something that Morgan really will never bring: size, physicality, and a mean streak that Craig Berube desperately wants in his defense core. Nurse is 6'4" and plays like he's 7 feet tall. He throws hits, he clears the crease, he makes life miserable for opposing forwards who try to set up shop in front of the net. In a playoff series, when the game slows down and becomes a war of attrition, you want Darnell Nurse on your blue line. You don't want Morgan really trying to move a 6'3" power forward out of the crease. You want Nurse doing it with prejudice. That's the theory, anyway. The financial reality of this trade is where it becomes truly questionable. Toronto would be absorbing an additional $1.75 million in cap hit by taking on Nurse's contract. That's not insignificant when you're already tight against the cap and trying to re-sign key players. But more importantly, you're extending your commitment from Reilly's deal, which expires in 2030, to Nurse's deal, which also expires in 2030, but at a much higher annual cost. If Nurse doesn't work out in Toronto, if his decision-making doesn't improve, if his defensive lapses continue, you're stuck with him for 5 more years at nearly $10 million per season. That's the kind of mistake that gets general managers fired and sets franchises back half a decade. Brad Treliving would have to believe, truly and deeply, that Darnell Nurse could be rehabilitated under Craig Berube's system. He would have to believe that Nurse's physicality and size are more valuable than really skating and offensive instincts. He would have to believe that the identity change this trade would bring is worth the financial risk. That's a lot of belief for a player who's been one of the most criticized defensemen in the NHL over the past 2 seasons. Let's also consider what this trade would mean for Edmonton. The Oilers would be getting Morgan Reilly, a defenseman who can move the puck, who can quarterback a power play, and who would thrive playing behind Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. Reilly's offensive instincts will be maximized in Edmonton's high-octane system, and his defensive deficiencies will be less exposed when he's not being asked to be the number 1 guy. For Edmonton, this trade makes a lot of sense. They shed nearly $2 million in cap space. They get a more mobile defenseman who fits their style, and they move on from a player who's become a symbol of their defensive failures. But here's the thing about trades that make sense for one team. They usually don't make sense for the other. And this trade, for all of Doug MacLean's enthusiasm, probably doesn't make sense for Toronto. Yes, Nurse brings physicality. Yes, he brings size. Yes, he brings an edge that the Leafs desperately need. But he also brings a contract that could cripple the team's flexibility for years. And there's no guarantee that his game improves in a new environment. Sometimes a change of scenery helps, and sometimes it just means you're making the same mistakes in a different uniform. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the trade target that actually makes sense, the one that's realistic, achievable, and would genuinely improve the Toronto Maple Leafs without mortgaging the future. Blake Coleman is available, and the Leafs are showing strong interest. This is the move that Brad Treliving should be focusing on, not some pie-in-the-sky swap of bad contracts. Blake Coleman is 34 years old, but he plays like he's 28. He's a 2-time Stanley Cup champion with Tampa Bay, winning in 2020 and 2021, and he was a key contributor in both runs. He's the definition of a playoff warrior, the kind of player who elevates his game when the stakes are highest. He kills penalties. He plays a defensively responsible game. He can chip in offensively when needed. And he brings a championship pedigree that the Leafs desperately need in their locker room. The connection between Coleman and Brad Treliving is significant. Treliving was the one who brought Coleman to Calgary, and he knows exactly what he's getting. He knows Coleman's work ethic. He knows his character. He knows that Coleman is the type of player who makes everyone around him better. That familiarity matters, especially when you're trying to add pieces at the trade deadline and don't have time for players to adjust to a new system. Imagine a third line with Blake Coleman centering it, flanked by David Kampf or Kaye Jarnkrok on one side, and maybe Bobby McMahon or Nick Robertson on the other. That's a checking line that can shut down the other team's top players, while also contributing offensively. Coleman's ability to win faceoffs, his defensive zone awareness, his penalty-killing expertise, these are all things that the Leafs need desperately. He's not going to put up 70 points, but he's going to be on the ice in the final 2 minutes of a one-goal playoff game, and he's going to make the plays that win championships. The cost to acquire Coleman wouldn't be prohibitive. Calgary is having a rough season, sitting near the bottom of their division, and they're likely going to be sellers at the deadline. Coleman has 1 year left on his contract at a reasonable cap hit, making him the perfect rental acquisition. A second-round pick may be a mid-level prospect. That's probably the asking price. It's the kind of move that improves your team without gutting your future, and it's exactly the type of smart, calculated risk that contending teams need to take. But here's where the situation gets more complicated, and here's where the urgency of these trade rumors becomes crystal clear. Joseph Woll left the game against Carolina with a lower body injury after the Leafs' 5-1 victory. With Anthony Stolarz already on the shelf with no clear timeline for return, Toronto's goaltending situation has gone from concerning to critical in the span of one period. If Woll is out for any significant length of time, the pressure on the defense to be perfect every night increases exponentially. This is why the Darnell Nurse conversation, as questionable as it might be, hasn't died completely. If your goaltending is unreliable, you need defensemen who can clear the crease, who can block shots, who can make life easier for whoever's between the pipes. Nurse, for all his faults, does those things. He's not afraid to take a puck to the face. He's not afraid to engage physically in front of the net. And he eats minutes like they're going out of style. In a scenario where Dennis Hildeby or Artur Akhtamov are your starting goaltenders for an extended period, having Darnell Nurse on your blue line starts to look less insane and more necessary. Blake Coleman also becomes more valuable in this scenario. If your goaltending is shaky, you need forwards who can play defense, who can help out in your own zone, who can kill penalties and prevent the other team from getting high-danger chances. Coleman is elite at all of those things.